that, nothing really new in terms of where we're at in the class. We still have that assignment that has been out there for a while, right? Should be due, what, the 8th is next Wednesday. So you've got just about a week to work on that. I also will be putting some final exam materials in this folder. So that folder under files currently doesn't have anything underneath it. That's where I'll be putting those practice problems as well. So that should, once again, I'll get those up there this afternoon. I've been in the car for like 6 hours between yesterday and today, and was dealing with an old dog. Don't ever let your dogs get old. It becomes much harder to take care of them. So where we're at though was we started talking about the labor supply and labor demand curve, and we left off thinking about, well, now we can determine equilibrium wages and the quantity of workers in labor markets, right? Because once we have a supply curve, once we have a demand curve, it goes back to just like what we were doing in the product market, and where those two things intersect, where the marginal cost of that last unit of labor supplied is equal to the marginal benefit of that last unit of labor supplied. That will be the point where we're in equilibrium, right? Excuse me. So we can start to think about what would happen to equilibrium wages if things shift that labor supply and that labor demand curve. Okay. So we talked about the things that affect that labor demand curve. Zoom in a little bit here. We said that the demand for labor really was just the value of that marginal product of that labor, which was just the price of the product that that labor created times the number of additional units of that product that that labor created, right? That kind of represented the value of that worker, right? And the value of that worker, firms would pay up to that amount, or they'd be willing to pay up to that amount. So we said that was kind of the demand curve for labor. So changes in anything that would change the price of the good or the effectiveness of the worker was going to start shifting that demand curve around, right? And would alter equilibrium. So I'm not going to use the clickers here, but these would be good ones to know how to kind of go back and solve. Let's say we've got the labor market for auto workers. So which one of these would kind of show the effects of baby boomers working in this industry retiring, right? Well, it's a little bit weird here, like we said with the labor market, everything's kind of flipped on its head, right? So now kind of the workers, right? We usually think about like, that's usually like how we think of ourselves, I guess, as like workers, or we're consuming things. The workers are supplying the labor, right? So if we see a bunch of people retire, it's kind of like before in the product market when we said, well, what if we have fewer firms? So if we have fewer suppliers of a good, what would happen to the supply curve? It would decrease or shift to the left. So if we have fewer workers to supply labor, we're going to see a decrease in the supply curve, okay? So if we see this decrease in the supply curve, or this shift left, right, what's going to happen to my equilibrium wage? Well, before it was here, now it's going to be up here. So when I have price here, when I think about the price of labor, we said last class, anytime we're drawing out kind of a labor market, probably makes a little more sense to think about the quantity of labor instead of the price of labor. What we really call that in our everyday language is the wage, right? So I had my original supply curve for labor, my original demand curve, my equilibrium wage would be right here, equilibrium number of workers, I'm going to call this Q1 star and W1 star. We then saw all these people retiring, which made my supply of labor decrease. These should be drawn parallel, but so we'll kind of call this the supply of labor 2. Now we can see that the equilibrium wage has gone up and the equilibrium quantity of workers has gone down. Right? You can kind of think about this almost like if there's just fewer people out there, right? I'm going to have to pay them a little bit higher wage, right? Because there's less competition, right? When there was more people in the labor force, well, if I didn't, if I paid a low wage and someone said, I'm not going to take that. Well, okay, I know there's probably someone else out there who will. Now, and the shift probably wouldn't be this dramatic, where I'm drawing kind of dramatic to kind of just really accentuate that point. So this decrease or leftward shift in supply would drive up wages in that market. Okay. Any questions on this before we kind of keep moving here? Okay, so we're really just back to thinking about supply and demand shifts. Okay, so down there. Let's say, what if we had domestic auto workers, and it shows that buyers are kind of shifting their preference towards imported automobiles, right? So if people are kind of substituting away and buying kind of more imported cars, if we're looking at the domestic auto car market, you can kind of think about this maybe going back like 40 years or so. What kind of happened to Ford and GM was that people stopped buying as many domestic produced cars. So the domestic auto worker labor market, right, how would that be impacted? Well, this is kind of a two-part story. Let's say that we just think about initially just the product market, okay? So this is like the quantity of domestic cars. Okay? So initially they start out supply, demand. Kind of think about the equilibrium price would be somewhere right here. If fewer people really are purchasing, or they're substituting away from domestic cars to buying imported cars, or at least cars that are produced somewhere else, that's going to be a decrease or a leftward shift in the demand curve, right? There's a lower demand for domestic automobiles, okay? So our new equilibrium price fell. Okay? How is that going to impact the domestic auto worker labor market? Well, let's draw out our labor market. Okay. So they initially started out, there was some supply and some demand for labor. But if we remember that the demand for labor is the value of this marginal product, which is the price of the good times the marginal productivity of that labor force. Right? So let's assume for a second that after this change, right, people will start wanting domestic cars less. Let's just assume that our workers aren't any more or less productive, just so that we're kind of keeping this constant. But we know that because of that demand shift in the product market, that decreased the price of domestic automobiles. So if there's a decrease in the price of domestic automobiles, what's going to happen in this labor market? The demand for labor is going to decrease. Yeah, follow kind of the same trend as the product market. So I forgot to identify the equilibrium wage earlier, but it would have been right here. And after this change, we now see that the wage in the labor market for domestic automobiles has also fallen. So anytime we see like a shift in the product market, if it change, right, that's going to change the price of the good. That will also kind of change wages that we see paid to workers that, you know, work in that particular field, right? In this case, I was using kind of domestic automobiles to be the case. Okay. Is that making sense? Are there any questions on that? Okay. So these two things are tied together. And that's really because if the price of what I'm selling goes down, then what my workers are producing is just worth less to me, right? Well, if it's worth less to me, then I'm willing to pay that worker not near as much, because the marginal benefit of having that worker to me as the firm has gone down, right? The value of the product they're creating is no longer as high as it was before, because people just aren't willing to pay that high of a price. So I think there we kind of see that decrease in demand. So if we go back to that slide, all right, we should see this decrease, this leftward shift in demand kind of driving wages down. Okay. What if I had some technology improvement in this industry? Okay. Well, if we go back here, let's say we start out in that original starting equilibrium, right? P1, W1. If I see an improvement in technology that makes my workers more productive now, so maybe the machinery's gotten better, so, doing the same job they were before, they can now create 100 additional kind of units, right? Or I don't know, whatever the automobile part is they're creating. What's going to happen to my demand for labor curve? If my workers are more productive, the marginal product of each one of my workers is now going to be higher. So think of this technology not as like something that's substituting out for the workers, but it's just making my workers more productive, right? They were using some machinery before. This technology improvement allowed the machinery they were using to just be even more effective, right? But it didn't replace the worker, okay? In fact, that relationship between kind of capital and labor, I don't think we'll really dive into that in this class. If any of you continue to take econ courses or pick up a minor or something like that, there is a labor econ course that we have that would kind of dive into deeper into those issues. But if we have technology that improves our current workers' productivity, the demand for labor is going to increase or shift to the right, which is then going to, we call this W3, right? Increase that equilibrium wage. And that kind of makes sense. If my workers are more productive, they can create more product, I'm going to be willing to pay them more because they're bringing more money in to the company, right? Any questions on this one? I know I kind of put them both in the same graph, but here we can kind of think about, if it was the only thing that was on the graph, we saw this increase in demand, okay? Questions yet? Yeah. Yeah, so if we had more workers or something that caused workers to supply more of their labor, that would be a shift in that supply curve. If our workers become more productive, it's not necessarily that they're willing to supply any more labor than they were before. They might be working the same 40 hours. They might be willing to work the same 40 hours, or the same 10 individuals might be willing to do that job. However, doing that same job, the value to the company is higher. So because it's the value to the company, they're the ones that are demanding the labor. That's why we see that increase in demand instead of supply. Yeah, there's not many, like, for the sake of what we're doing in this course, really the only thing that we're thinking about in terms of shifting the supply for labor would be things like, we haven't really talked through all of them, but kind of the one that I introduced today is like the idea that there's more or less, just fewer workers like out there. You could think about what's something else that might affect the supply of labor. Well, what if, I'll actually work through this one. So let's say, a good example. I got a good one. So let me draw out this graph here real quick, and then we'll kind of set up some context. So let's say this is the equilibrium wage. And let's do for, call this some government job. Right? So maybe this is like the government pays individuals, to name the position, do some type of like data analytics for them, or maybe we can think about this as like public, just some kind of public servant, right? Maybe someone who is a secretary of treasury, or not secretary of treasury, what do they call them? Like a financial person for the state, right? For the government, okay? So there's going to be some supply of labor for these government positions, okay? Kind of working in the financial aspect of these government positions. The problem is, as private organizations and companies have grown, they have a lot more funds, like guaranteed, like Google or Amazon can outspend the government in terms of paying a worker for that same job a lot more money, right? So what do we see happen, right? If you could go work for the government as, data scientist or whatever it is for, say $100,000, There's a private company, which they're creating a product that's highly valued, right? So they're willing to pay you more money. So maybe if you go out into the private sector, you could make 150,000. What do you think most people, unless they have like some real strong intrinsic motivation to help out society, what job would most people choose if both were offered? One pays them 100,000, one pays them 150. Probably the one with a higher wage, right? So if you have all these large companies coming up that are drawing people away, right? Because they're now higher wages at the same kind of position, but just in a different sector, right? Private versus government. What's happened over time to the demand curve for government positions is that not demand curve. So we're talking about people leaving. So people leave to go to the private sector. We see this decrease in supply, right? So you kind of think about, what has this decrease in supply done? Well, actually over time, it's going to actually drive up wages for those government positions, because that's the only way they're going to be able to kind of attract people away from those private firms, right? You see this, I like to think about this a lot. This is like a similar story with outside wages impacting labor markets. This happens a lot with teachers, right? In the sense of, if you have teachers who are really highly skilled, like the most skilled people in math aren't teaching high school mathematics, right? That's because there's a lot of other positions that have much higher wages. So you have that supply curve to teach high school mathematics, or the supply curve for labor being, decreasing quite a bit, right? And that does help raise up the wages for these high school math teachers, but it's still, as you see more and more positions outside of a high school, right? All these higher wages that they could go take, you see them, the supply curve for high school math teachers, if we look across time, consistently decreasing. That's the same idea. So it has to be something that draws people out of that labor market, right? Or makes, there has to be some other option that's more attractive. And usually the way we talk about this is like a position with a higher wage. Obviously, it's a more nuanced problem in the real world, where it's like, well, there's wages, but there's also like my, just enjoying my job, and how much do I value that? I might take a job with a lower wage because I enjoy that more than this job has a higher wage. But we generally use wages to kind of think about, for the most part, if we're talking about pretty large gaps in wages, that would attract people to kind of leave a labor market. And then conversely, you can think about, for those kind of private sector jobs, we've actually seen the supply curve increase, right? More people are attracted to kind of entering those fields. Does that help kind of get at why that was the supply? I know I kind of went off on a tangent there, but any questions on this? All right, so I think the time. Okay, so let's think about how taxes on a good might impact the labor market, okay? So if I have an income tax, sorry, not tax on a good, we can do that. We can do an example of that as well. I didn't realize that. I said the income tax first. So let's say I have an income tax, right? What is that going to do in my labor market? Right? Oops. So I left this slide blank. If you wanted to have these print out and write on it, you could. So we got our wage. You kind of think about, let's start out thinking about a scenario where there is zero income tax, right? So like we're comparing to like the perfect world, right? There's zero income tax, or we can kind of call this, I guess, the wage when there's no tax. And we also think about, this is going to be the wage, or not the wage, the quantity of labor with no tax, okay? So if then going from no income tax to some positive value of income tax, right, actually imposing one, what's going to happen to the demand for labor? Well, the price of the product, that income tax doesn't really impact that at all. Doesn't really impact the productivity of my workers. So our demand curve for labor isn't going to be impacted by the income tax. However, if you think about for individuals, right, our supply curve reflected how willing they were, right, to work, or the cost to them. They would be willing to supply their labor at whatever value this was, because that was like what they were giving up. You would need to pay, for this quantity of labor, you would need to pay at least this wage, because if you don't pay anything higher than that, then the cost to supplying that labor is actually greater than the benefit to the worker, right? So remember, this reflects the cost to the worker to supplying the labor. So let's say we're looking here. If I try to offer this person a wage that's this low, they're going to say, well, look, the benefit of supplying my labor now is much lower than the cost, so I'm not going to work for that, right? This is like the bare minimum I need to supply this amount of labor. Okay. So if you impose an income tax, what happens at every single unit of labor supplied, right, is, oh shoot, now whatever amount I make, I actually am earning less, right? If I was earning $100, now you impose an income tax of 10%, I'm actually only earning $90, right? I only get to keep 90. So what you would have to do, right, if I was, just to put some numbers to this, if this person was only willing to supply this amount of labor for $100, right, whatever this $100 an hour, whatever it is, well, once you impose that tax, he feels like he's only getting 90. So he's not going to work for that. So what you would have to do as a company, or the amount that you would have to pay that worker now, would be what, $111, I guess, right? It would have to be like 10% higher, or you'd have to make up for that income tax. So at every single quantity of labor, you would now have to pay that worker a little bit more, or we see this, that should have went through the dots, but there we go. Right, you would see this decrease in the supply for labor once you impose this tax. Fewer workers out there means there's less competition, so that drives up the wage, right? But that income tax would also drive down the equilibrium number of workers we see in that labor market. Right? So these income taxes make the supply curve for labor shift to the left. And it's really because at every single unit of labor supplied, they now require a higher amount, because they're not going to keep it all. Right? That's a kind of a good way to think about it. Okay. So an income tax really potentially is going to drive up our equilibrium wages that we see, but it decreases our kind of equilibrium number of workers, right? It might drive some people out of the labor market. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say there. Any questions kind of on that? And it also looks really similar to what we're doing with the product market, right? We said that a lot of times we would just write this is the old labor supply plus this income tax, right? When we taxed the good, it shifted supply to the left. When we tax the income market, that we're taxing the producers or the suppliers of labor, right? We would also see kind of this decrease in our supply. So it works very similar to the product market. It's just when you think about it, I think it operates a little bit differently. Okay. Questions on that before we keep moving? All right, so that was just another thing you can think about that might shift supply. And you asked about that earlier, what kind of other things that might shift supply. Might skip around a little bit. Actually, I'm going to go a little off script because there's something I wanted to do that's not in the slides. So let's say we've got this labor market, and just like the product market, we want to think about how government intervention might affect it. So we just talked about taxes. What about we have a labor market, and it's currently an equilibrium. So we'll call this Q1 star and W1 star. Right? What happens if we impose a minimum wage? So let's say, whatever industry this was, I don't know, the equilibrium wage was something like $10, right? It's kind of small, so $10, right? The government then comes in and says, well, look, I'm going to impose this minimum wage, and say you have to at least pay your workers $15 an hour. So they're essentially setting a price floor. Right? So we talked about these in the product market, and they work the exact same way in the labor market. And I think I might have introduced this idea at the time. We'll dive a little bit deeper into it today. Okay? So if I set this minimum wage at $15, whatever industry this is, maybe it's like the fast food industry, they turn around and say, well, you know, shoot, we're only paying workers 10. We actually have to increase how much we're paying them, right? Because we're not meeting federal regulations or state regulations. However, at $10 an hour, right, they demanded a lot more labor than when labor cost them 15, right? So what's going to happen is the amount of workers that a company or that in this industry that would be hired at this higher wage is going to go down dramatically, right? Now, any worker in this range is worth less to the company. Remember, this reflects the value of the marginal productivity of labor, or kind of the marginal benefit to the companies that are consuming labor. So now if I'm paying all these workers $15 an hour, well, for all of these workers, they weren't adding more than $15 to my company, right? Or in terms of, you know, $15 per some time unit, probably per hour. They weren't adding $15 per hour to my company, and so it no longer makes sense for me to employ them. We see the equilibrium wage, or sorry, the equilibrium quantity with the minimum wage is now much lower than if we had this market, kind of a free and open labor market. We also see that wages went up, right? If I impose this minimum wage, my new equilibrium wage with the minimum wage will just be whatever that minimum wage was, right? As long as it's effective, right? As long as I put that price floor above the current equilibrium, we would say it'd be an effective price floor, okay? And it would drive the wage up to $15 an hour, but it would decrease the number of workers that I have. So you can kind of see here, I mean, if I keep my job after a minimum wage, I love a minimum wage, right? If I'm the one that keeps my job, the problem is for all these people, they now aren't employed, right? So it benefits the workers who are able to keep their job, right? Or the ones who were really skilled, right? Remember, these people up here, the demand curve is reflecting the value of the marginal productivity of labor. Well, the price of the product is the same for every worker, but right, those first few workers I hire are going to be the most effective or the most skilled or producing the most, right? So for my skilled workers, they benefit from the minimum wage because they keep their jobs. They're valuable enough to the company's okay paying them a higher amount. But for my more unskilled workers, or the people kind of on the lower end of that distribution, well, they're no longer worth as much as the company has to pay them, and so all of them lose their job. So we could think about, if we're thinking about surplus, right, kind of the area between demand and supply, all of this surplus is going to be lost after that minimum wage is imposed. So these minimum wages cause a lot of deadweight loss to society. What is that deadweight loss? It's the surplus loss from, right, basically now the unemployed individuals. Does that make, is there any questions on that? Is that making sense? What if something else happened, or you want me to re-explain something? Okay with that? So like I say, it looks exactly like the price floor we had before, but we have this huge deadweight loss, okay? So what's maybe something we could do instead? So I've thought about this for a while. I'm not the first person to think about this, but anytime I hear something about a minimum wage, my mind instinctively goes to here. But maybe there's a better way, right? Why do we even impose a minimum wage, right? Well, because we believe that the labor market isn't factoring in all the costs and benefits, right? But there may be some externalities to society to have people who are working for a wage that isn't above the poverty level, right? Now, those costs and benefits aren't in this labor market necessarily. They're more like in the market for like other things in society. So because the free and open labor market is arriving at a wage that's a little bit too low for a lot of people, right? Well, that's going to have a lot of costs in other areas in our society. So maybe it makes sense to raise that wage. The problem is We raise the minimum wage here. Well, maybe that takes care of some of those other externalities, but it creates this huge deadweight loss, right? So what's another maybe strategic way we could get at this? Let me see. Well, actually, we'll hold off on that. So let's say instead of a minimum wage, so we start out here, this is kind of our reference point where we didn't have the government intervening at all. Okay. What if instead we somehow subsidized workers, right? So we don't impose this additional cost on the companies, right? So that they have to pay a higher minimum wage, right? But we subsidize workers, right? So we say, look, if you go work X number of hours, for every hour, we're going to give you this amount of money. Okay? What would happen in this market? Well, now, whatever their marginal cost was, right? Basically, if I was willing to work for $100 before, right, I would actually be willing to work for, let's say the subsidy for every hour I work is $10, right? Well, now I'd actually work for 90, right? Because with this subsidy, right, I would still be making 100, okay? So at every single labor supply, the worker would actually be willing to kind of take a lower amount of money, right? Because they're getting a lower wage, but they're getting this additional subsidy. So they're really making the same amount. So we can actually think about, or if it's easier to think about, if I'm going to have the same wage as I did before, but I'm also getting this additional subsidy, well, maybe that increases the amount of people who would be willing to go out and get a job, right? So I'm actually going to see kind of this increase in my labor supply curve that kind of includes that subsidy. Or essentially a subsidy is a benefit, so it's lowering my costs, right? It's lowering my cost of providing that labor because I'm getting this additional subsidy just by supplying my labor. So what that could do in the labor market is actually drive wages down, right? But that decrease in the wage is more than overcompensated by that subsidy. So if you kind of think about the take-home pay, right? Well, before I go to the take-home pay, so we've got this lower wage, and I should have done this in red. Hold on, just to make this a little bit more clear. Okay. So it's lowered the equilibrium wage, but it's increased the number of people who are working. As opposed to before, with a minimum wage, we were decreasing the number of people who are now working. Right? The problem is that you look at this, you might think, okay, well, it's great that we got more people to get a job, to enter this labor force, but we've now decreased everybody's wages, right? So it seems kind of like, well, this isn't better than a minimum wage. Yeah, more people are working, but they're working for less money. However, this is the equilibrium wage that the company pays, right? So we can think about here, this is like the wage, how do I label this? Oh, instead of putting this on the graph, let's go down here. So this is going to be the wage that the company pays, right? But how much money does the worker get to keep? Well, they get the wage the company pays them, but they also get this additional subsidy, right? So kind of if you want to think about it almost like the take-home pay, how much the workers are actually taking home is going to be whatever the company pays them plus this subsidy. Remember, the only difference between that original supply curve and the supply curve with the subsidy was the value of the subsidy. So at this new equilibrium quantity, if we add in the value of the subsidy, the actual take-home pay of workers, we can call this W star take, right? Or Well, this is really the same thing as kind of like the take-home pay, right? So initially, like, you might look at this and think, oh, it's going to decrease wages. Well, yeah, it will decrease the wages that the company is paying. So if I actually subsidize workers, companies are actually going to like this, right? They're now paying their workers a lower wage. However, the workers also like this because even though the company is paying them a lower wage, the amount of money they take home is that wage the company pays them plus the subsidy, right? Which you can kind of see here is greater than what their wage was before. Okay. Excuse me. Any questions on that?
Where would that subsidy be coming from?
Well, that's the problem, right? It's great for the people involved in this labor market. It's great for the companies and the workers that are in this labor market. This is the problem with any regulation. So if I think about here, these additional units, when we had subsidies before, this kind of area represented my deadweight loss, right? Because even though there was some gains and to both the producers and consumers in this market, really the loss, and we didn't dive too much into the deadweight loss for subsidies, and that's because I'm probably not going to put that on the exam, but it does exist, right? Because we're overproducing, and even though there's benefits to the consumers and producers, who's fronting that cost? Who gives out the subsidy? Yeah, the government, right? So it's great for the workers and producers in this market and labor market, but who's it bad for? Taxpayers, right? Whoever's paying the taxes, right? They're kind of fronting the bill for this deadweight loss. But if we believe, this becomes more of a moral issue, right? If we believe that in these labor markets where wages are too low, that if we can help out the workers or the producers, right? People supplying their labor in this labor market, if we can help out those workers by taking tax dollars from people who are in labor markets that are making more than high enough wage, right? Then we're okay with that. So maybe what we do, see if I get the right ones, right? We use an income tax to overtax the rich, use that additional, right? We're not as concerned with the deadweight loss that's occurring to the overly wealthy, right? To then help out individuals in labor markets where those wages are lower, right? So maybe more of like a complete picture kind of idea. Now, maybe you don't agree with that at all. You think everything's a meritocracy, whatever, you could, whatever, but you're right. Someone is hurt here, and it's basically the taxpayer.
Wouldn't it typically be the owners of said businesses that would essentially be hurt? So
Here?
In turn, well, yeah, you're saying it's the individual, the overly wealthy individuals, but are they typically the ones owning businesses, therefore in turn hurting businesses?
Well, if you do it through an income tax.
I know like directly it's coming
Yeah.
people, but
So, I guess, I would argue probably not the majority. I mean, if you're thinking about the uber wealthy, right, then yes, for sure, you're probably, that the moral issue becomes, where does a person start and a company begin, right? Like, if I'm taxing Elon Musk, if I'm taxing Tesla for whatever, something it's creating, I'm really taxing the owner of the company, right? So, I mean, where does the line get drawn? But, for the vast majority of people who are in high income brackets, they're not business owners, right? I mean, lawyers, dentists, whatever, you name it, they're paying a pretty high income tax, right? And so, yeah, you're hurting. I mean, even with an income tax, right, there is some deadweight loss that was, it's weird here, but it would be consumer surplus or the surplus of the people consuming labor. So you are hurting companies a little bit here in whatever labor market these people work in. But, if we believe as a society, right, and we value there's some additional benefit to equality, right, in terms of income equality, then maybe we're okay with that, right? Because even though we have losses on the high end of the income distribution, we believe that those don't really impact those people's lives near as much as the gains that we're getting on the lower end of the income distribution.
also to be fair, a lot of the super wealthy don't really provide labor per se, right? They just make money.
I mean, though, if we're talking about the uber wealthy, that's kind of a slightly different story, right? I mean, once you get to a certain level, there's ways, especially if you're talking about people who own large corporations, there's ways to not pay any taxes, right? This is not a class where we'll dive into the tax code of America, right? There's a lot of issues with it, especially when you look at that, the real uber wealthy. But you've got to think about, there's a large majority of people here. I mean, we're talking about high income taxes, right? That's what I mentioned, like dentists, lawyers, doctors. I mean, there's people who are making good money, but they're not multimillionaires, right? And so, it becomes a more nuanced discussion about, do we treat, certain income brackets different than others? And we do in America, right? You see the income tax breakdown, like there's definitely different kind of categories, right? It's not just anyone who makes over $100,000 or over, this X, whatever cutoff you set. We do break it down into kind of different brackets, right? But yeah, hopefully these are good questions. We're starting to see like all these things are really tied together, right? Because I could make up, I wouldn't for this, for the exam or anything like this, but we could start out with, we could even think about, where was the original one we started with today? We could even go back to government regulation in different product markets, and that would have downstream effects on labor markets. And then maybe we, to counteract those downstream effects of the regulation of the product market, regulate the labor market, right? Like to try to compensate that. So you can make up some really complex and very complicated stories. I mean, this stuff gets very difficult when you have a ton of competing factors happening at the same time. What we're trying to do is just break down like one individual factor of those at a time. And I'm sometimes taking a little step further. I probably won't push it that far in the exam, but I do want to tie these things together to kind of create the bigger picture, hopefully. Okay. Any other questions? These are good questions. I love the cynicism too. We should all be cynical when we're talking about government regulation. So, okay. All right. So hopefully I'm not sounding like an anarchist or anything today. I think that's probably where I'll stop. I think on Friday, oops, I didn't want to do that. Let me see what we got here left in the slides that I posted for this week. I believe we've got, we're talking about capital a little bit. I've got some inequality stuff. We'll tie the human capital into the labor market. So we'll still kind of be sticking with the labor market. We're going to be diving a little bit more into these topics, these issues that we kind of left off. I mean, at least touched on, which is what's the income inequality look like in America, and how are some ways maybe we can improve it. Okay. So look for those practice problems in that final exam folder this afternoon, as well as that last final homework. Remember, I said I dropped the lowest one. So if you do these first 5, you don't even have to worry about the 6th one. It's more of a study tool. Okay. All right. We'll see you guys on Friday.